The wind is low over the grass now, moving softly across the Machair, as if it were smoothing the land with an open hand, and you can feel the evening air resting cool against your face, while the Atlantic lies somewhere beyond the dunes, breathing in long, slow folds of silver sound. Under your feet, the ground is not quite like ordinary earth, because it is lightened by old shells, by fragments of creatures that once lived in clear water, and by sand that has been lifted from the shore and carried inland for centuries until the land itself has become pale, sweet, and softly shining beneath the grass. You are standing where the Hebrides turn their western edges toward the ocean, where island air moves over low fields and white beaches, and where the Machair spreads as a gentle flowered skin between sea and moor, neither entirely shore nor entirely meadow, but something tenderly made from both. The light is not leaving quickly, because this far west it seems to loosen itself from the sky with care, laying a diluted gold across the dunes and across the small heads of clover, buttercup, and thrift, while every hollow in the grass gathers a little more blue shadow. You can hear the sea without needing to see it, a steady hush beyond the dune ridge, and the sound seems to travel through the stems around you, through the dry seed heads and the low leaves, until the whole plain feels quietly alive with breath. Here, the land has been built by patience, by wave and wind and tide, and by the slow wearing down of shells into sand so fine that it can be lifted inland and laid across older peat and rock, softening the island edge into a wide, pale pasture of flowers. The Machair is a rare kind of coastal grassland, found most beautifully along the Atlantic edges of the Hebrides, where the sand is rich in lime from broken shells, and where the constant ocean weather keeps the ground open, low, and gently changing. You can imagine each grain arriving by a quiet route, first as a shell in the shallows, then as a fragment rolled and polished by the surf, then as dust-like sand taken by the wind and set down beyond the beach, where rain roots and time slowly folded into the living surface. Nothing in this place seems hurried, because the shape of it has come from small movements repeated over and over. The tide drawing back, the wind crossing the shore, the grasses catching sand, the dunes rising a little, then settling, then rising again. As you begin to walk, your steps are cushioned by close grass and springy moss, and the ground gives slightly beneath you, not as mud, not as dry dust, but as a soft woven mat of root and shell sand, held together by years of quiet growth. Around you, the flowers are low and numerous, not arranged in great dramatic displays, but scattered like tiny lights, with white clover, red clover, bird's foot trefoil, daisies, eyebright, orchids, and yellow rattle making a patient constellation across the grass. In places, the Machair looks almost simple from a distance, just a smooth green plain behind a white shore, but when you lower your gaze, the whole world becomes intricate, full of small leaves, small petals, small insects, and the minute pathways of stems leaning together in the wind. The lime in the sand changes everything here, because it makes the soil sweeter than the peatlands beyond. And that difference allows many delicate flowering plants to grow where only a little farther inland, the moor becomes darker, wetter, and more acidic. So the Machair feels like a meeting place, a quiet agreement between opposites, where the sea gives shell and salt and motion, while the island gives rain and roots and shelter, and together they make a meadow that belongs to neither one completely. The wind moves again softly enough that it does not disturb the peace, and the grasses bend in broad, slow patterns, each blade leaning with its neighbors, each flower nodding once or twice, as though the whole plain were remembering the rhythm of the tide. Beyond the low meadow, the dunes rise in pale curves, their edges softened by marram grass, and you can see how the roots hold the sand in place, not with force, but by a kind of patient weaving, a quiet net beneath the surface. Marram is one of the great builders here because it catches blowing sand around its stems, and as the sand gathers it sends roots deeper and shoots higher, allowing the dune to grow slowly upward, grain by grain, season by season. The dunes are not walls, exactly, because they shift, breathe, and change, but they shelter the Machair from the full strength of the Atlantic, filtering the wind and catching the sand before it travels farther across the island. You can stand beside them and feel how the land rises gently, not in cliffs or peaks, but in soft rounded forms, pale at their feet and green on their backs, with rabbit-nibbled grass and small flowers tucked into the leeward hollows. There is something calming about a landscape made from fragments, because nothing here began as one solid thing, and everything has been gathered slowly from countless pieces, each shell grain, each root thread, each seed and fallen leaf becoming part of the whole. The beach beyond the dunes is still near enough to scent the air, and at times a trace of salt passes over the grass, cool and clean, mixing with the faint sweetness of clover and the green, almost milky smell of crushed stems underfoot. You do not need to hurry over this ground, because the Machair rewards slowness, and the longer you look, the more the plain opens into layers, with sand beneath soil, roots beneath flowers, insects beneath leaves, and the sea's long memory beneath them all. A small bumblebee moves low among the blossoms, its body furred and heavy with pollen, and it works the clover with unhurried concentration, entering one small purple head after another, while the wind presses the petals lightly around it. Other insects move almost invisibly, tiny flies and beetles and moths, each one finding food, shelter, or a place to rest among the short vegetation, and their presence makes the meadow feel quietly busy without ever becoming loud. The Machair's richness is not the richness of height or density, because there are no towering trees here, no deep canopy, no heavy shade, but rather the richness of openness, where sunlight can reach nearly everything and small plants can live close together. That openness is one reason birds come here, especially in the long northern summer, when the grasses thicken and the flowers rise, and the plain becomes a nesting place for lapwings, skylarks, meadow pipits, and the secretive corncrake calling from cover. You might hear a skylark above you before you see it, a thread of song lifted into the wide air, and because the bird itself can be no more than a speck, the sound seems to belong to the sky rather than to a single body. The lapwing moves differently, with rounded wings and a wavering flight over the fields, and its presence feels like part of the land's gentle pattern, a dark shape turning over pale grass, then settling somewhere out of sight. Even the birds that are restless by nature seem held within the same softness, because the Machair is wide enough to receive their movements without drama, and the sound of them rises and falls within the larger hush of sea and wind. The day's warmth is fading now, and the colors are becoming quieter, so the buttercups lose some of their brightness and become small pools of dim yellow, while the white flowers hold the last light a little longer. You can see how the ground dips and lifts in shallow waves, echoing the sea beyond the dunes, and each little hollow has its own dampness, its own collection of plants, its own slightly different tone of green. Some places are cropped short by grazing animals, keeping the vegetation open and letting small flowers reach the light, while other places grow a little taller and softer, so the wind can comb them into faint ripples that pass over the meadow and disappear. The Machair has often been shaped by a gentle pattern of seasonal use, by grazing, cutting, and resting, and when that rhythm is light enough, it can help maintain the open flower-rich grassland that makes this ecosystem so delicate. It is not wilderness in the sense of being untouched, but it is deeply natural in the way tide, wind, grass, animal, bird, and human care have sometimes moved together across generations, creating a landscape that is living rather than fixed. Still, when you stand here in the evening, the strongest presence is not human at all, but the immense, slow exchange between sea and land, the ocean offering its ground shells, the wind carrying them inward, and the plants turning them into meadow. You can feel that exchange under every step, because the Machair is made from the sea without being the sea, and from the land without being quite inland, and that in-between quality gives it a calm, floating strangeness. As the light lowers, the islands beyond the plain become gentler in outline, low hills or darker ridges resting against the sky, and the farther moor takes on a dusky brown, while the Machair remains pale and open before it. The contrast is part of the landscape's quiet beauty, because the Machair often lies like a narrow, luminous band along the Atlantic side of the islands, with white beach on one side and dark peatland on the other. Here the sand is alkaline, there the moor is acidic, and between those two chemistries the plants change, almost as though an invisible line is being drawn beneath the roots. guiding what can flourish and what must wait elsewhere. You do not see that chemistry directly, of course, but you feel its result in color and texture, in the flowers at your ankles, in the softness of the turf, and in the way the land seems unexpectedly bright, even under a dim sky. Rain has also shaped this place, falling often and lightly, rinsing salt from leaves, moistening hollows, and helping roots draw minerals from the shell-rich ground, so that the meadow can remain green even when the wind has been dry. Because the Hebrides receive so much ocean weather, the Machair is never entirely still in a physical sense. Yet its movement is calming because it is made of repeating patterns, showers passing, sun returning, wind bending grass, and the tide breathing beyond the dunes. You may notice small pools in low places where rain has gathered over compacted ground, and around them the plants shift again, becoming wetter, darker, and more rush-filled, while insects skim the surface and birds leave fine prints in the mud. These damp hollows are part of the same quiet system, because the Machair is not a single flat meadow, but a mosaic of dry ridges, moist depressions, dune slopes, sandy tracts, and flowered fields, all changing gently with season and weather. The more slowly you move, the more each difference becomes visible, and the landscape stops being simple, becoming instead a softly patterned fabric in which every thread has its own place. A white shell rests in the grass, far from the waterline, and it seems almost like a message from the sea, though nothing here needs to speak loudly, because the evidence of old waves is everywhere beneath the roots. Some shell fragments are so finely broken that they have become part of the soil's body, giving calcium to the ground, changing the plants that can live here, and making the Machair one of the most flower-rich coastal grasslands in northern Europe. Other fragments remain visible after storms or in bare patches, bright against the green, reminding you that this soft pasture has been made from ancient marine life, from the slow arithmetic of countless shells becoming sand. There is comfort in that kind of transformation because nothing is wasted here, and what once drifted in water can become a meadow, and what seems broken can become the pale foundation for clover, orchid, and grass. The path ahead is faint rather than marked, just a slightly lower seam through the vegetation where feet and hooves have passed, and as you follow it, the dunes hide and reveal the sea in small glimpses. Sometimes you see only a strip of brightness between grass and sky, and sometimes the Atlantic opens suddenly as a wide grey-blue field moving with slow folds toward the shore, though even then the sound remains softened by distance and sand. The waves are part of the Machair's making because they grind shells and carry sand upward with storms and tides, while the wind completes the journey, lifting the light grains and letting them settle where plants can catch them. In this way, the landscape is not only a place but a process, and even when it looks still, it is continuing, receiving, losing, repairing, and reshaping itself in a rhythm older than any single season. You can let that thought settle slowly, the idea that a landform may be peaceful not because it never changes, but because its changes are patient enough to feel like rest. The evening grows cooler, and with the cooling air comes a more intimate scent from the ground, a mingling of damp sand, bruised grass, and the faint mineral sweetness of lime-rich soil. The flowers begin to close by small degrees, not all at once, and the insects move more slowly among them, while the calls of birds become more spaced apart, as though the whole Machair were lengthening its breaths. Somewhere beyond the dunes, the tide is turning or has already turned, and though you cannot see the exact moment, you can sense the sea as a great presence keeping time, measuring the island's edge with water instead of clocks. There is no need to name each minute here, because the Machair teaches a softer form of time, one counted in flowering seasons, nesting seasons, storms, calm spells, sand movement, and the gradual deepening of roots. Under the grass, roots hold the thin living layer together, binding shell sand and organic matter into a skin that is both fragile and resilient, easily marked by pressure, yet able to heal when given quiet time. This is why walking gently feels natural here, because the land itself seems to ask for lightness, not with warning, but with softness, offering a surface that receives your steps and then slowly rises behind you. You pass a patch of orchids, their small forms tucked low among other flowers, and their colors are muted by dusk, lavender and rose and white becoming part of the general blue of evening. Orchids in the Machair can be surprisingly abundant because the thin calcareous soils and open grassland create conditions where they can grow without being shaded out, each plant living within a web of fungi, moisture, and seasonal light. They do not need to be large to be remarkable, and perhaps that is one of the quiet lessons of this place, that beauty can be close to the ground, almost hidden, and still be complete. You bend your attention rather than your body, letting your gaze rest among the stems, and the more gently you look, the more the small flowers seem to appear. The Machair's summer abundance comes after long months of wind, rain, and salt air, and it feels all the more tender because it rises from such exposed ground, not in defiance of weather, but in relationship with it. Plants here are adapted to low nutrient conditions, shifting moisture, grazing, and salt-laden breezes, and many stay small, tough, and close to the earth, keeping their leaves where the wind can pass over them without tearing. Their resilience is quiet rather than dramatic, the resilience of flexible stems, deep enough roots, low growth, and timing, each species finding a way to flower in the open while the ocean weather moves around it. To rest your attention on such plants is to notice a form of patience that does not announce itself, a patience made from returning each year when the light is right and the soil has warmed enough to wake. The sky is wider now, a pale northern dusk stretching over the low islands, and the clouds have softened at their edges, turning from pearl to grey to a faint violet that seems to gather above them all. In this light, the Machair feels almost afloat, as if the flowered plain were a calm raft between the darker inland hills and the breathing Atlantic held in place by roots, sand, and the hush of evening. You may feel the same softness in your own body, a gradual loosening, as the rhythm of the place becomes easier to follow than any thought you brought with you. The land is doing very little, and yet it is doing everything it needs to do, holding flowers, feeding insects, sheltering birds, receiving rain, and listening to the sea. A curlew's call may come from somewhere far off, long and liquid in the dimness, and it seems to curve through the air as gently as a stream through grass, leaving behind a silence that feels even deeper than before. The Machair receives that sound without changing the way it receives wind and weather, and you can imagine the call traveling over dunes, fields, and wet hollows until it thins into the wide quiet. Nothing here needs to be hurried toward meaning, because the place is already whole in its own slow manner, and your part is simply to be present within it, breathing as the grasses breathe. As darkness gathers, the individual flowers become less distinct, but the meadow as a whole becomes more luminous, not with light exactly, but with the memory of light held in pale sand and low blossoms. The shell-rich soil reflects dusk differently than peat or stone, and even when the sun is gone, the Machair can seem faintly bright, a soft band of land remembering the sea it came from. You can look toward the shore and imagine the long line of broken shells beneath the surf, being rolled and ground and lifted, preparing perhaps for some future meadow, some future patch of clover or orchid not yet visible. The thought is gentle enough for sleep, because it stretches time until nothing feels urgent, and the present moment becomes one grain among many, carried, settled, and held. The wind has eased further now, and the grasses no longer ripple in broad waves, but tremble only at their tips, as though the whole plain has lowered its voice to a whisper. In this softer air, small sounds become clearer. A wing beat, a stem brushing another stem, the distant hush of surf, and the faint shifting of sand at the edge of a rabbit path. The dunes beside you are dim shapes now, but you know their pale bodies continue beneath the grass, holding the memory of storms, calm days, winter winds, and summer roots within their layered sand. If you could see inside them, you might find old surfaces buried under newer ones, thin lines where plants once grew, traces of older dunes held quietly beneath the present slope. Landscapes like this are always storing time. They're not in straight lines that can be easily read, but in layers, mixtures, and textures where the past becomes part of the ground under your resting feet. The Machair is especially tender in this way because it holds marine history and terrestrial life together, making one surface from two worlds and letting them remain softly entwined. You continue across the plain, following the faint path as it turns away from the largest dunes and moves through a lower, damper stretch where the grass is darker and the air feels cooler. Here the plants change again, with rushes rising here and there, and the ground carrying a little more water, so each footstep seems quieter, more absorbed, as though the meadow were taking sound into itself. The dampness matters because small differences in water level create different habitats across the Machair, and a shallow hollow may support plants and insects that do not live on the drier sandy ridges nearby. In this mosaic, variety comes without sharp boundaries, because one patch flows into the next, dry into moist, flowered into rushy, cropped into taller grass, the whole landscape changing as gradually as breath. You can rest in that gradualness, because nothing asks you to decide where one place ends and another begins, and the land itself seems content with transition. A moth lifts from the grass and drifts a short distance before settling again, pale enough to catch what remains of the evening, and for a moment it seems less like an insect than a small moving petal. Moths belong to the Machair night as surely as bees belong to the day, visiting flowers in dimmer hours and carrying pollen through a world where scent and softness become more important than color. As the temperature falls, scent rises more clearly from certain blossoms, subtle and close to the ground, and the meadow becomes a place known by breath as much as sight. You may notice how the dark does not empty the landscape, but changes the way it is perceived, shifting attention from color to outline, from detail to texture, from distant views to the small space around you. This is one of the comforts of evening on the Machair, that the world does not vanish as light fades, but grows more inward, more quiet, and more willing to be felt rather than measured. The sea remains beyond the dunes, and its sound is steadier now that fewer birds are calling, each wave arriving as part of a long murmur that has no clear beginning and no clear end. That murmur has shaped the sand, and the sand has shaped the plants, and the plants have shaped the lives of insects and birds, so the entire meadow can be heard, in a way, inside the surf. You are not separate from that chain while you stand here, because the same air moves across the ocean and over your face, and the same quiet settles over grass, dune, flower, and skin. The Hebridean evening deepens around you, cool and open, while the Machair lies low under the sky, continuing its old work of holding together the gifts of sea and island. And as you move a little farther inland, where the flowered grass begins to meet the darker edge of moor, the pale ground underfoot slowly changes, becoming less sandy, less sweet, and more shadowed by peat. The plants tell you before anything else does, because the clovers grow fewer, the orchids become rarer, and the greens deepen toward brown and olive, as the lime-rich influence of shell sand thins into the older island soil. This boundary is not abrupt, and that is part of its beauty, because the Machair does not simply stop. It loosens, fades, and mingles, as all natural edges often do when they have not been cut too sharply. You can pause here and look back toward the shore, where the meadow remains faintly pale in the dimness, and it seems almost like a low, calm light laid between the ocean and the moor. The contrast reminds you that the Machair is both small and immense, narrow in physical extent, yet wide in meaning, because it gathers geology, weather, biology, and time into one soft threshold. Behind you, the dunes continue to hold their shapes in darkness, and beyond them the beach receives the tide, each wave moving over sand that may someday travel inland and become part of the grass beneath another evening. Ahead the moor waits with its own quiet, darker and wetter, smelling of peat and heather and rain. But tonight the attention remains with the pale meadow, the shell-ground plain that rests at the island's edge. You turn back toward the Machair because there is still more to feel in its open calm, and the path leads you once again through low flowers that have become soft shadows at your feet. The air is cooler close to the ground, and the scent of salt has thinned, leaving more room for damp grass and the faint sweetness of clover, as if the land were exhaling slowly after the day. Above you, the first stars may begin to show through the pale northern sky, and they appear not suddenly, but gradually, one point after another, as gently as flowers appearing in grass when your eyes learn where to rest. The Machair in darkness is not empty, because roots are still drawing water, insects are still moving through stems, birds are settled in cover, and the shell sand remains cool beneath the living mat. All the processes continue without display: the slow chemistry of soil, the quiet respiration of plants, the minute movement of small animals, and the sea beyond, still working at the shells and stones of the shore. There is peace in knowing that so much can happen quietly, without brightness, without speed, without needing to be witnessed, and the Machair seems to embody that peace in every low curve of ground. You can let your thoughts become like sand here, loosened from their hard shapes and carried by a gentler current, until they settle into the open spaces between grass stems and sleep. The landscape does not ask anything more from you, and as the dark deepens, it becomes easier to imagine lying down in the soft shelter of the dunes, with the meadow around you and the sea beyond. Not to disappear, but to rest within a pattern that has room for everything slow, everything small, everything that grows close to the ground and shines only when the light falls just right. The Machair holds this kind of rest naturally, because it is made from long patience, and because its beauty is never forced into grandeur, but spread softly across low land where each small flower matters. The surf continues its distant breathing, and the wind moves only slightly now, and the Hebrides seem to float in their own evening silence, while the shell sand meadow lies between water and moor like a pale, living dream. You remain there a little longer, watching the shapes dissolve into dusk, feeling the ground's faint spring beneath you, and listening as the whole place becomes quieter, without ever becoming still. The sea is still making the shore, the wind is still remembering the dunes, the flowers are folded into night, and the Machair is resting in the long, slow darkness of the island edge. The darkness over the Machair is never a hard darkness, because even after the last color leaves the flowers, the pale sand beneath the grass keeps a faint memory of brightness, and the low land seems to breathe it upward through the roots. You can feel the air cooling in layers, first on your cheeks, then around your hands, then close to the ground where the day's warmth has been held a little longer in the sheltered hollows. The sea continues beyond the dunes, and its sound has settled into a wide, unhurried rhythm, while the grasses answer in smaller movements, each blade leaning and releasing as the night wind passes softly through the meadow. In this hour, the Machair becomes less like a field and more like a shoreline of sleep, a place where waking detail begins to blur gently, yet the whole landscape remains present and whole beneath the dim sky. You may no longer see each clover head clearly, but you can remember where they are, hundreds and thousands of small rounded blooms tucked among the leaves, holding the day's visits from bees inside their closing petals. The orchids are quiet too, their delicate forms now gathered into shadow, and the yellow rattle lies hidden among the grass, its seed capsules waiting for the dry whispering sound they will make later in the season. Even the names of plants seem to soften at night, becoming less like labels and more like textures. Clover, trefoil, eyebright, thyme, buttercup, each one part of the same breathing surface. The soil below them is thin, yet it is generous in its own particular way, because the broken shells have given it a mineral sweetness that allows many flowers to live close together without any one of them entirely taking over. This balance is part of the Machair's character, a low and open richness that depends on wind, grazing, salt, rain, and the repeated disturbance of sand, all held in proportions that are never quite fixed. Too much stillness would change it, just as too much pressure would change it, and so the place lives by a delicate movement, a continuing adjustment that feels calm because it has been practiced for so long. You can rest with that idea, that a landscape may remain itself not by resisting change, but by changing in small, returning ways that preserve its deeper shape. The path underfoot is dimmer now, and yet your body can follow it by touch, by the slight firmness of repeated passage and the faint hollow where grass has learned the direction of walking. To one side, the ground rises toward a dune slack, where sand and shelter create a cooler pocket of air, and in that slight depression moisture lingers longer after rain, feeding plants that prefer the gentler damp. To the other side, the meadow opens again, low and rounded, with only the faintest undulations showing where wind has laid sand unevenly over older ground. making a landform as subtle as a sleeping animal's breath. Nothing here stands apart for very long, because each ridge belongs to a hollow, each dry place to a damp one, each flower to a season, and each season to the turning sea. The Machair teaches connection quietly through the way one thing becomes another, and through the way every visible softness has a hidden structure holding it in place. Under the dunes, maram roots run deep and wide, finding sand that would otherwise wander farther inland, while their stiff leaves comb the wind and slow it just enough for more grains to fall. Closer to the ground, finer roots stitch the meadow together, and fungi thread through the soil in ways you do not see, carrying nutrients and messages through a darkness more intricate than the night above. Worms and small soil animals move through the upper layers, opening spaces for air and water, while fallen leaves and stems are slowly taken back into the ground, becoming part of the thin, dark matter that mingles with pale sand. The surface seems simple, but beneath it there is a quiet architecture of roots, pores, particles, and living bodies, all working without haste in the cool earth. You can imagine the shell fragments there, some sharp-edged, some rounded, some almost powdered into invisibility, each one a former life from the shallows now resting beneath pasture and flower. There is something deeply peaceful in that passage from sea creature to shell to sand, from sand to soil, and from soil to the stem of a tiny plant lifting itself into island light. The Machair is made of such passages, not dramatic transformations, but soft continuities that move matter through water, wind, root, blossom, seed, and back again into the patient ground. And because these changes happen slowly, they give the mind a place to loosen, as though thought itself could become part of the same gentle cycle. The night air carries a faint call from a bird hidden somewhere beyond your sight, and the sound stretches across the grass before fading into the wider murmur of the shore. In summer, the Machair can hold many nesting birds because its open structure, low vegetation, and small-scale variety create places for feeding, hiding, and raising young among the grasses. Some nests are no more than shallow cups on the ground, carefully placed among stems and leaves, and though they may seem exposed, they belong to a landscape where camouflage is a quiet form of shelter. The birds that live here are shaped by openness, by listening, by patience, and by the careful reading of wind, shadow, grass height, and movement across the plain. At night, when most of them fall silent, their presence remains like a softened memory in the meadow, folded into the dark with the flowers and the dunes. You pause where the path bends near a low sandy rise, and the wind is slightly warmer there, having crossed the dune face before touching the grass at your knees. The sand itself is mostly hidden under plants, but in a small bare patch it shows pale against the dusk, and when you touch it, it feels dry, cool, and finer than ordinary inland soil. Each grain has been moved many times, perhaps lifted from a beach during a winter storm, perhaps carried only a little way at first, then caught by grass, released again, and caught once more in a slower season. The history of the grain cannot be known, yet the whole landscape tells the general story, and that is enough, because the Machair does not need exactness to offer meaning. It offers patterns instead, the shore feeding the field holding the birds stirring the insects visiting the flowers, and the flowers returning themselves to the soil. In the dimness, the white flowers are the last to remain visible, small soft points among the grass, and they look almost like stars that have settled low to the earth. Above them, the sky has deepened to a calm grey blue, and the true stars are beginning to multiply, though thin cloud keeps them blurred, as if even the heavens have chosen not to shine too sharply. The Atlantic horizon is hidden now, but the presence of water remains everywhere, in the salt scent, in the sound, and in the cool openness that seems to arrive from beyond the dunes. You can let your breathing follow the surf, not matching every wave, but moving with the larger rhythm of arrival and release, the long inhaling and exhaling of the coast. The Machair at night feels like a place between breaths, held gently after the brightness of day and before the deeper dark, when forms are soft and the mind no longer reaches so hard for detail. If you look back inland, the moor is only a broad darkness now, yet it gives the pale Machair a kind of border, making the shell-ground meadow feel even more luminous by comparison. The moor has its own old beauty, built from peat, rain, heather, and slow accumulation, but here at the edge, the lime-rich grassland carries another story, one written by waves and wind. Between them lies a gradient of soil and plant life, not a line but a soft turning, where one community gives way to another through subtle shifts in chemistry, moisture, and exposure. Such transitions are often the richest places to linger, because they remind you that nature rarely speaks in hard endings, preferring overlap, mingling, and shade. You can feel that mingling in the ground underfoot, which is neither fully shore nor fully inland, and in the air, which tastes faintly of both salt and grass. The longer you remain, the more the Machair seems to gather around you, not enclosing you, but including you in its low and open way, as though stillness itself were a habitat. It is a quiet ecosystem, but quiet does not mean inactive, because night brings different movements, different senses, and different small exchanges among leaves, wings, roots, and soil. A beetle may be moving beneath a stem, a moth may be finding a pale flower by scent, and a bird may be listening from the grass, each life following its own soft path through the darkness. None of these lives need to be made large to be worthy of attention, and perhaps that is why the Machair feels so restful, because its abundance remains close, low, and uninsistent. You do not have to climb anything to understand it, and you do not have to look far, because the whole wonder of the place begins at ankle height and continues downward. It continues into the soil, into the sand, into the shell fragments, into the memory of shallow seas where calcium gathered in delicate forms long before it became meadow. And it continues upward too, into flower, wing, bird call, cloud, and the pale open sky above the Hebrides, where evening lasts longer than expected and sleep arrives by degrees. Every direction here leads gently into another, and every element seems to touch the next without hurry, as though the whole landscape were designed for drifting. A soft rain may begin far out over the ocean, though only the scent of it reaches you at first, a cooler mineral freshness that arrives before any drops can be felt. In the islands, weather often approaches like a presence, rather than an event, spreading through the air, dimming the horizon, touching the grass with a new scent before it changes the surface of things. When the first fine drops arrive, they are almost too light to hear, settling on leaves and petals, darkening bare sand, and gathering at the tips of grasses where they tremble without falling. The rain does not break the quiet, because it belongs to the quiet, and the Machair receives it with the same openness with which it receives wind, salt, sun, and night. Each drop carries a small part of the sky down into the soil, rinsing the leaves, softening the sand, and helping minerals move through the thin living layer beneath the roots. In wetter hollows, the rain joins water already held there, and the plants that grow in those places take it in slowly, while the drier ridges shed some of it toward lower ground. The surface is never uniform, and that is one reason the Machair can support so many forms of life, because slight changes in height and texture create many small conditions within one calm landscape. A few inches of difference may alter moisture, shelter, exposure, and plant community, so the meadow becomes not a single room, but many quiet rooms opening into one another. You can imagine the rain mapping those differences as it falls, revealing the hidden shape of the land through darkening sand and glistening grass. The scent of the meadow deepens as moisture settles, and what was faint before becomes clearer, the green breath of leaves, the sweetness of clover, and the cool mineral note of shell-rich soil. Rain on Machair has a softness unlike rain on stone, because the grass receives it first, breaking it into smaller touches before it reaches the ground, where roots and sand take it in. The dunes beyond are becoming darker where the rain touches them, though their pale bodies remain visible in the dim light, rounded and patient beneath their covering of maram. In winter, storms may reshape these dunes more forcefully, moving sand, opening scars, and laying new material across the land. Yet even that stronger movement belongs to the long making of the place. Tonight there is only this fine rain, arriving like breath on glass, and the whole meadow seems to lower itself into a deeper calm. You continue walking slowly, and the rain beads on your sleeves, while the grass brushes lightly against you and leaves faint, cool touches that vanish almost as soon as they arrive. The path becomes more fragrant under the rain because dampness releases the scent of earth and root, and the shell sand seems to give back a clean, chalky coolness. Somewhere nearby, water gathers in a shallow track, reflecting a small, blurred piece of sky, and for a moment the Machair holds the heavens in a puddle no wider than your hand. This is the scale of the place, wide when you look outward, intimate when you look down, and always shifting between openness and detail in a way that lets the mind settle. A distant sheep may move in the dark, only a pale shape for a moment, and then it becomes part of the general greyness again, cropping the grass with the same slow patience as the night. Grazing when light and seasonal helps keep the Machair open, preventing coarse growth from closing over the smaller flowers and allowing light to reach the low plants that give the meadow its richness. The animals leave tracks, cropped patches, and small nutrients behind them, and the plants respond in patterns that are not always obvious at once, but become visible across years. This, too, is part of the landscape's quiet ecology, not separate from its wildness, but woven into it where the rhythm remains gentle enough for flowers, birds, insects, and dunes to continue together. The Machair is a balance, and like many balances in nature, it is most beautiful when it feels almost effortless, though it is held by many hidden relationships. The rain eases after a while, leaving drops suspended along the grasses, and when the wind moves through them, the whole meadow gives off a faint, trembling sound. It is not loud enough to be called a rustle, not sharp enough to be a patter, but something between, a soft brushing of wet leaves and stems against one another. The sea has become more distant under the rain's after silence, or perhaps your attention has moved closer, settling among the plants and the damp ground rather than beyond the dunes. Either way, the world has drawn inward, and the Machair now feels like a small island within the island, a breathing skin of pale soil and low growth under the clouded sky. You stand still and let the quiet gather, noticing how a place can be spacious without being empty, and how a plain can feel sheltered even when there are no trees. Shelter here comes from low forms, from dune curves, from the bending grass, from the evenness of the horizon, and from the steady sound of the sea holding the edge of hearing. It also comes from repetition, because the mind recognizes the returning movements, wind over grass, rain into soil, waves on sand, flowers opening and closing with the light. After a time, those repetitions begin to feel like a lullaby made by the land itself, not sung for anyone in particular, yet available to anything willing to listen. The Hebrides have many weathers, but the Machair receives them all in a low posture, bending, absorbing, letting pass, and growing again when the season turns. In spring, the first greens rise softly through the old grass, and birds begin to claim the air with song, while the ground warms just enough for roots to quicken. In early summer, the flowers spread across the plain, not as one color, but as many small colors held together, and the meadow becomes a living tapestry laid beside the Atlantic. By late summer, seed heads begin to dry and rattle, grasses lean into gold, and the same wind that once carried sand now carries seeds through the open field. Then autumn lowers the light, bringing softer colors and heavier rain, while the plants return themselves to the soil and the birds shift their patterns, some leaving, some arriving, some simply becoming quieter. Winter opens the structure of the place, showing more sand, more dune shape, more bare ground, and the weather's hand becomes easier to see on the exposed island edge. Yet even in winter, the Machair is not empty, because roots remain, seeds wait, birds feed, and shell sand continues to hold the possibility of another flowering season beneath the cold. The year moves through it as a slow circle, and the land accepts each phase without preference, as though bloom and bareness were only different breaths of the same life. Tonight, you are somewhere within that circle, held in the cool part of evening, after the flowers have closed and before full darkness has settled over the grass. The rain has left the air very clear, and though the clouds remain, a pale opening appears near the western horizon, where the last hidden light of the sun rests behind the sea. That light touches the wet grass only faintly, but every drop receives it, and for a little while the meadow seems covered in small, quiet sparks. They do not glitter sharply because the light is too soft for that, but they glow and fade as the grasses move, like a low constellation stirred by the wind. You can follow one droplet with your eyes until it slides from a blade and disappears into the roots, completing a tiny descent that echoes the larger movement of rain into soil, soil into plant, and plant into earth again. Such small descents happen everywhere, all the time, and the Machair is full of them. Water sinking, sand settling, seeds dropping, shadows lengthening, and the day lowering itself gently into night. The landscape seems to invite the same movement in you, not downward into darkness as into an ending, but downward into rest, into steadiness, into the kind of quiet that holds rather than empties. You breathe in, and the air is cool with rain and salt, and you breathe out, and the meadow remains unchanged and softly present. Far off, a wave folds onto the beach, and then another follows it, each one smoothing the shore for a moment before drawing back and leaving the sand newly patterned. Those patterns may be gone by morning or covered by another tide, but some of the sand will dry, lift, and move inland, joining the long, slow migration that helps renew the Machair. The shore is always giving and taking, and the meadow is always receiving and transforming, so the land at your feet is part of a conversation without words, carried on through matter and motion. There is no beginning you can point to from here, and no final shape waiting in the distance, only the ongoing tenderness of a coast that keeps remaking its own edge. This is why the Machair feels ancient, even when the flowers are new, because the process behind it reaches beyond any single bloom, any single season, any single human memory. The petals that opened this morning may be gone in a few days, but the conditions that allowed them to bloom were prepared by centuries of shells, storms, roots, grazing, and rain. To stand among them is to stand inside deep time made gentle, not stone towers or mountain walls, but a soft field where ancient marine minerals feed small living color. The scale is immense, but it has been folded into something you can touch, something low enough to brush your ankles as you pass. And that quiet nearness makes the age of the place feel restful rather than distant, like an old song hummed under the breath of the sea. The path now leads toward a slightly higher ridge, and from there the view opens just enough to show the dark line of dunes, the pale suggestion of beach, and the wide unseen water beyond. The tide's voice is fuller from this height, though still softened, and you can sense the beach stretching empty beneath the night, its sand smoothed by water and printed perhaps by birds. Behind you, the Machair continues inland in a low sweep, broken by damp hollows and faint tracks. And beyond that, the moor rises in deeper shadow toward the heart of the island. Everything is arranged with a natural quietness. Sea, dune, Machair, moor, and sky, each layer resting beside the next, each one distinct and yet joined by weather. You can look across them without needing to choose where your attention belongs, because the whole island edge seems to breathe together in one long motion. The dunes are the first shelter, the Machair the bright receiving ground, the moor the darker memory inland, and the sea the maker and remaker at the boundary. In daylight you might notice cattle paths, fences, croft fields, and sandy tracks, but in this dusk those signs soften into the larger landform, becoming part of the texture rather than the story. What remains strongest is the feeling of openness, the sense that the sky has come down close to the grass and that the grass has risen gently to meet it. The horizon is not sharp, and the night is not heavy, and the whole place seems suspended between earth and water, as though it were floating in the evening. You may feel tired now, but it is a clean tiredness, the kind that comes from slow walking and cool air, from listening more than speaking, from letting a landscape set the pace. The Machair does not ask for alertness in the ordinary way, because there is no spectacle to seize you, no sudden height, no glittering cliff, no rushing river. Its beauty works gradually, entering through small repeated impressions until your attention becomes softer and more open, and the mind stops looking for the next thing. Here, the next thing is often only another blade of grass, another quiet flower, another breath of sea wind, and somehow that is enough. It is more than enough, because the ordinary becomes deep when it is allowed to remain ordinary. A final wash of light fades behind the cloud bank, and the wet meadow dims again, though the drops still hold a little grey sheen wherever they cling to the stems. The night insects begin to own the lower air, moving in ways too small for you to follow, while the plants stand quietly with their leaves beaded and their flowers closed. Beneath the surface, roots continue their slow work, drawing moisture through narrow passages, holding the soil against erosion, and preparing without consciousness for another day of wind and light. This hidden labor gives the machair its calm strength, because what looks delicate above ground is supported by countless small anchors below. And as you sense that unseen holding, you may feel something in yourself loosen, trusting the ground, trusting the rhythm, trusting the slow intelligence of place. The sea beyond the dunes has no need to be seen now, because it has become part of the night's body, a deep, continuous sound that marks the edge of the world. The dunes receive that sound first, then pass it inward in softened form, and by the time it reaches the meadow, it is no longer a roar, but a murmur wide enough to rest inside. The machair listens with its whole surface, with grass and sand and hollow and root, while the moor behind listens differently, more darkly, holding rain in peat and shadow. You stand between these listenings, at the calm threshold of ocean and island, and the quiet around you seems not like absence, but like attention. A place can listen without ears, in the sense that it receives everything that arrives: light, rain, salt, bird call, hoofstep, seed, and the passing warmth of one summer day. The machair has received these things for a very long time, and it has made from them a low landscape of extraordinary gentleness, where the smallest forms of life become visible to anyone who slows down enough. Even now, when visibility is fading, the awareness of those small lives remains, and the meadow feels populated by folded wings, sleeping petals, breathing roots, and seeds waiting in the soil. There is companionship in that, a quiet kind that does not interrupt the silence, but fills it with soft belonging. You are not alone here, though nothing asks you to answer, and the night continues to gather around the flowers. The rain clouds thin at last, and a few stars become clearer above the western dunes, their light traveling down to a land made partly from the remains of ancient shells. That meeting of starlight and shell sand feels almost too delicate to name, yet it is happening everywhere around you, light from far beyond the earth, touching calcium lifted long ago from the sea. The thought can drift without needing to become grand, because here even immensity is made calm by the scale of the grass, by the soft footing, by the nearby sound of waves. The universe, the ocean, the island, the meadow, the flower, the grain of sand, all seem to rest within one another tonight. And you can rest there too, held among them, as the machair settles deeper into its cool and luminous dark. The dark is luminous in a way that belongs only to open places, where the sky has room to lower itself gently, and the ground has room to answer without becoming bright. You can still feel the path beneath you, though it is less visible now, a faint firmness through the wet grass, guiding your steps with the quiet memory of those who have crossed before. The machair does not close around you like woodland, and it does not rise above you like mountain stone, but instead spreads outward in low breathing space, allowing the night to settle evenly across its surface. A breeze arrives from the shore, cool and faintly salt, and it moves through the grass in a long passing stroke, bending the stems together before releasing them again into stillness. The sound of that movement is almost the sound of someone turning a page very slowly, and in that page there are shell grains, flower seeds, old rain, bird tracks, and the slow, pale writing of the sea. You can imagine the meadow by day, bright with tiny colors, yet at night it becomes more like an undercurrent, not seen in detail but felt as a presence flowing just below the edge of sight. The flowers are folded, the insects quieter, the birds settled low in cover, and still the whole place feels awake in its own inward way, as if life has simply lowered its lamp. This is one of the gentle truths of ecosystems, that activity does not always announce itself, and the living world continues through hidden exchanges long after the visible world has gone soft. Plants still breathe through their leaves, slowly taking in and releasing gases through tiny openings, while roots continue to rest in damp mineral darkness, touching sand, humus, fungal threads, and the small spaces where water gathers. The soil is cool around them, held by the night and by the ocean air, and every root hair exists in a fine borderland of moisture, chemistry, and darkness. Nothing here is separate from that unseen world, because every flower you noticed earlier was only the uppermost gesture of a life that spends so much of itself below. You can let that thought move downward through you, from the face and hands into the chest, into the limbs, until your own attention seems to grow roots in the quiet. The Hebridean sky stretches overhead in a softened dome, and the clouds that remain are thin enough for starlight to pass through them, blurred but steady, like light seen through deep water. The comparison comes naturally here, because the Machair itself is a kind of sea remembered on land, a meadow born from marine shells, shaped by coastal air, and held beside the endless movement of Atlantic waves. Each patch of grass, each low blossom, each sandy rise, contains something of that sea, not as water now, but as mineral, texture, brightness, and the faint alkaline sweetness that changes what can grow. The shore gives itself inland slowly, and the island receives it slowly, and between that giving and receiving, this rare grassland has learned how to flourish. You walk a little farther, and the ground rises just enough for the wind to touch you more clearly, carrying the cool scent of wet marram from the dunes. Marram grass stands in firmer clumps than the low meadow plants, its narrow leaves rolled against drying winds, and its roots reach deep enough to help hold shifting sand in place. Around those roots, grains accumulate after every blow of weather, and the plant responds by growing through the new sand so that burial itself becomes part of its living rhythm. There is a calm lesson in that, because what might seem like covering can become support, and what settles over time can sometimes lift a living thing higher toward the light. The dune ridge is darker against the sky. A slow wave of land paused before the sea, and its crest looks soft rather than sharp, combed by wind into a line that refuses straightness. In daylight, you would see rabbit paths crossing the slopes, pale scars where sand has opened, and tufts of grass leaning inland under the constant influence of western weather. Now those details are gathered into silhouette, and the dune seems almost asleep, though it is still doing its old work of sheltering the Machair from the full force of salt and storm. The dune is not a barrier so much as a breathing threshold, porous, changing, protective, and made from the same fragments that once turned and flashed beneath shallow water. Beyond it, the beach is hidden, but you can picture it by sound, a wide strand of pale sand receiving wave after wave in the darkness. At the edge of the tide, shells are being moved, not dramatically, but with steady repetition, lifted, rolled, set down, and lifted again, until their shapes soften and their edges disappear. Some will remain on the shore, some will return to the water, and some, in dry weather and strong wind, will travel inland to join the dunes and fields. This is the quiet geology of the Machair, not fire or uplift or sudden fracture, but the mild persistence of abrasion, transport, settling, binding, and growth. The land is made in gestures small enough to be missed by an impatient eye. Yet over generations those gestures become a habitat, a coastline, a place with its own scent and sound. You can feel that time scale opening beneath the night, and it does not make the present feel small in a lonely way, but rather held within something long and forgiving. The steps you take are brief, but they are taking place on a surface prepared by centuries, and beneath each footfall is a history of waves, shells, winds, animals, and flowering seasons. The oldness of the Machair is not heavy because it has been ground fine, mixed with roots, softened by rain, and spread into pasture where small white flowers can glow at dusk. A faint movement crosses the grass, perhaps a small bird shifting from one hidden place to another, and then the meadow becomes still again, though not empty. The stillness here has texture, made from the distance between sounds, from the softened edges of forms, and from the way the sea's murmur fills the background, without asking to be followed. You notice how your breathing has slowed, not because you forced it, but because the whole landscape seems to breathe at a pace wider than thought. The surf, the wind, the grass, the cooling earth, each moves in its own rhythm, and together they make a pattern that feels older and steadier than any single heartbeat. There is a comfort in being at the edge of an island, where land does not end abruptly in your mind, but loosens into sand, dune, meadow, moor, mist, and water. Edges like this can feel uncertain by day, but by night they become restful, because everything is softened into relationship, and the boundaries between one thing and another are no longer so strongly insisted upon. The Machair itself is an edge ecosystem, and like many edges, it is full of life, because materials and conditions meet here that do not meet in the same way farther inland. Marine calcium meets island rain, Atlantic wind meets grazing meadow, dune sand meets plant root, and the result is a rare openness where color and seed can gather close to the ground. You can kneel in thought without needing to lower your body and imagine the small world between the stems, where droplets cling to hairs on leaves and grains of sand rest against living roots. A snail may move there in the dampness, slow enough to be almost invisible, leaving a shining trail that catches no light now, but still marks its quiet passage. Tiny spiders may anchor silk between grasses, and though the strands are too fine to see, they hold their own small architecture in the moving air. The meadow's smallest structures are as real as the dunes and the shore, and they too are shaped by tension, weather, material, and the soft persistence of use. A landscape can be understood from far away, as a pale band along a dark island coast, and it can also be understood from within a single square of turf. In that square there may be several species of grass, clover leaves, moss, a seedling orchid, grains of shell sand, the burrow of a small invertebrate, and a fallen feather caught among the stems. The closer you look, the larger the place becomes, because detail opens into further detail, and even a low meadow under night can expand until it feels almost endless. This kind of vastness is not measured in height or distance, but in interconnection, in the number of quiet lives sharing one small space. The wind eases again, and for a while there is only the sea and the faint wet sound of droplets releasing from leaves into the grass below. You can imagine those drops moving into the soil, entering pores between sand grains, touching fragments of shell, dissolving tiny amounts of mineral, and carrying that chemistry into reach of roots. From there, the minerals may enter a leaf, a flower, a seed, or the body of an insect feeding on nectar, continuing a journey that began in the sea and now passes through meadow life. The cycle is not closed in a perfect circle because nature is more braided than circular, but it returns often enough to feel like a slow and gentle turning. There is no single center to the Machair, no one object that explains it, because its beauty depends on relationships spread lightly across the land. If you focus only on the flowers, you miss the sand. And if you focus only on the sand, you miss the roots. And if you focus only on the roots, you miss the tide. So the mind learns to widen and soften, to hold many small things without gripping any of them too tightly, which is also a way of moving toward rest. The landscape becomes a practice in loosened attention, and every sound, scent, and dim outline helps draw you further from the sharpness of the day into a more spacious calm. Across the grass, the rain-darkened hollows are nearly invisible now, though your feet can still feel the slight changes as the ground firms, softens, rises, and dips. In one hollow, water may persist for days after rain, creating a miniature wetland within the Machair, where rushes and sedges grow among the flowers and where small invertebrates find shelter. On a nearby ridge, the soil dries sooner and shorter plants flourish in the thinner cover, using the openness and lime-rich sand to flower before taller growth can overshadow them. This patchwork of conditions creates a patchwork of life, and the whole meadow depends on such subtle variation, because sameness would make it poorer, while gentle difference makes it rich. The same is true of sound, because the night is made from layers, with the surf far off, the grass close by, and occasional bird calls suspended somewhere between them. A soft note rises from the dark and falls away, and then there is space enough for the sea to return, filling the silence as water fills a hollow. You can let the sounds pass through you without following their sources, the way one lets thoughts pass through before sleep, noticing them and then releasing them into the larger hush. The Machair seems to understand release, because it is always letting things go. Petals into seed, seed into soil, sand into wind, rain into root, and day into night. The temperature drops another little measure, and the coolness is now settled rather than arriving, evenly spread across your face and through the damp grass. A thin mist may begin to form near the hollows, not a heavy fog, only a pale softening close to the ground where moisture and cooling air meet quietly. The mist blurs the lowest stems and makes the meadow appear even more level, as though the land were wrapped in a thin breath of its own making. It gathers especially where the ground dips, tracing the hidden contours with softness, and it reveals the shape of the machair by making some parts disappear. There is peace in that partial seeing, because not everything needs to be clear for a place to be known, and sometimes uncertainty itself can become restful. You keep near the dune side now, where the sand is firmer and the grasses grow in small, tough clumps that lift their leaves into the salt air. The maram makes a dry whisper when the breeze touches it, different from the wetter meadow grass, and the two sounds mingle like two quiet instruments playing the same slow tune. Along the dune's lower edge, flowers grow where conditions allow, tucked into shelter, taking advantage of the lime-rich sand and the slightly warmer pockets formed by slope and exposure. The whole dune face is a set of small climates, sunlit here, shaded there, dry above, damp below, each microclimate offering a different invitation to life. In daylight, you might see the blue of harebells in some places, the yellow of ladies' bedstraw, or the soft pink of thrift facing the sea. Now their colors have gone into darkness, but the forms remain in memory, and memory itself becomes part of the landscape you are walking through. The night does not erase what the day revealed. It simply asks you to carry it more gently without the need to look directly at every detail. So the Machair by night is partly visible and partly remembered, and that combination makes it feel tender, like a familiar shore heard from a room where someone is falling asleep. The surf lowers, or seems to lower, as the tide shifts along the beach, and its rhythm becomes less full for a while, more spacious between each fold of water. Tides are among the quiet regulators of this coast, not touching the Machair directly every day, but shaping the beach that supplies sand, shells, and the conditions from which the dunes grow. High tides, low tides, spring tides, winter storms, calm summer evenings all leave their differing marks on the shore, and some of those marks eventually travel inland as grains. The meadow is therefore connected to the moon as well as the sea, to gravity as well as grass, to celestial rhythm as well as soil. It is a quiet thought, and the kind that can drift overhead like a cloud without needing to become heavy. The stars are clearer now in the breaks between clouds, and the open Machair receives their light without interruption from trees or buildings. So the sky feels close and wide at once. You may see a faint band of brightness where cloud thins over the Atlantic, and beneath it the dune line lies dark, as if the land were folded into the lower edge of the sky. Everything has become silhouette and softness, yet the scientific facts remain gently present, because knowing how the Machair is made does not reduce its mystery. It deepens it, because each sensory detail now carries a hidden explanation, and each explanation opens into another sensory detail, the way a shell opens into spiral space. The pale soil is beautiful, and it is also calcium-rich. The flowers are delicate, and they are also adapted to openness. The dunes are soft, and they are also builders of shelter. Knowledge, when held lightly, becomes another form of wonder, not a lantern shone too brightly into the dark, but a small warm glow kept close in the hand. You can walk with that glow, letting it illuminate only enough: the broken shells beneath the grass, the roots in sand, the night insects, the tide beyond the dunes. The rest can remain unseen, because mystery is not the same as ignorance, and the unseen life of the Machair is part of what makes the place so calming. There are always more processes than you can follow, more histories than you can name, more lives than you can notice, and the meadow continues whether or not attention reaches them all. This is a relief, in its way, to be reminded that the world is broader than thought and kinder than the need to understand every detail. A small gust passes over the ridge and presses the wet grass briefly against your legs, then moves inland toward the darker moor with a sound like cloth being drawn across a bed. After it passes, the air feels newly still, and the droplets on the stems tremble for a moment before settling back into their delicate positions. You can hear your own movement now, the faint parting of grass at each step, the soft contact of foot with sandy turf, and the quiet return of stems behind you. The path continues not as a road, but as a suggestion, and following it feels less like going somewhere than allowing the land to guide the pace of your attention. Soon it bends toward a wider open patch, where grazing has kept the grass very low, and the surface feels almost like a green skin stretched over pale sand. Here, even in darkness, the land seems smoother, and the flowers are fewer for a little distance, though small leaves and mosses remain pressed close to the ground. Such closely grazed areas can be important in their own way, offering feeding spaces for birds and allowing tiny plants to persist where taller vegetation might otherwise close over them. The Machair is not one texture, and its quiet health often depends on this shifting pattern of short and taller growth, wet and dry, sheltered and exposed. Variety does not disturb the calm. It is the calm expressed in many low voices across the field. You pause again because there is no hurry, and the night around you seems to lengthen, not in time exactly, but in depth. The sea continues to fold itself onto the shore, and the dunes continue to hold their pale bodies against the wind, and the Machair continues its slow work under your feet. Somewhere in the soil, seeds lie dormant, waiting for conditions they cannot know in any thinking way, yet responding when warmth, light, moisture, and season bring the proper invitation. Dormancy is not emptiness, but a form of patience written into life, a held possibility that may remain quiet until the world around it becomes ready. The thought is soft enough to carry into sleep, because it suggests that rest can be active below the surface, even when nothing visible seems to be happening. All around you, the Machair rests in that sense, not stopped, not silent in any absolute way, but lowered into its slower nighttime rhythms. The flowers will open again when light returns, insects will lift from the stems, birds will call across the plain, and the shell sand will shine beneath the morning. For now there is only this dark, this damp grass, this breathing shore, and the long, slow companionship of a rare coastal meadow holding itself together at the edge of the sea. You turn your attention toward the beach once more, though your feet remain on the Machair, and you imagine the hidden strand as a pale corridor between water and dune. The tide has smoothed it with repeated touch, leaving ripples in the sand that mirror the ripples of water, and perhaps a strand line of kelp lies higher up, dark and glistening. That kelp, too, may feed the wider coast, breaking down where it rests, sheltering small creatures, releasing nutrients, and connecting the offshore world to the landward one. Even what is cast ashore becomes part of the island's quiet economy, taken by birds, insects, microbes, weather, and time into new forms of usefulness. The Machair is not isolated from these exchanges, because nutrients and materials move across the coast in many subtle ways, carried by wind, animals, water, and the slow migrations of matter. A feather dropped by a gull, a shell fragment blown inland, a seed caught in wool, a leaf returning to soil, each is a small crossing of boundaries. The land is full of crossings, but none of them are hurried tonight, and the darkness makes each imagined movement feel even more spacious and slow. You stand within those crossings without needing to direct them, and the old human habit of controlling things can loosen, because the Machair is already held by its own relations. The island air has a softness now that comes after rain, when dust has settled, salt has thinned, and every scent has been rinsed clean. It carries the coolness of the Atlantic and the damp breath of the grass, and with each inhalation there is a feeling of being gently cleared. Not emptied, but cleared, the way a shore is cleared by tide, or a dune faced by wind, or a mind by listening long enough to one steady sound. The surf offers that sound, patient and low, and the meadow offers another beneath it, a hush of grasses leaning together under the night. Between them, your thoughts can become less separate, less edged, and more like the mist gathering in the hollows. The pale ground beneath the grass is still there, though darkness has taken its color. And beneath that pale ground lies the older island, rock, and peat, and memory. The Machair is a relatively thin layer over deeper histories, yet thin things can be powerful when they change the surface where life meets air and light. A few inches of shell-rich sand and living soil can alter the plants, the insects, the birds, the grazing, the colors of summer, and the entire feeling of an island's western edge. Depth is not always vertical, and sometimes the deepest places are made from thin layers repeated gently over wide time. The Machair is deep in that way, a shallow surface with an ancient understory. You move again, and the path slopes almost imperceptibly toward a damp stretch where the grass brushes higher against your ankles, and the air smells faintly of rush. The darkness there is cooler, and the ground takes your steps with a softer response, as though water is held just below the surface. In such places, the plant community changes because roots encounter different conditions, and what grows there helps mark the hidden water table more clearly than any sign could. Plants are quiet instruments of measurement, revealing pH, moisture, exposure, nutrients, grazing, and history through their presence, absence, abundance, and form. To learn a landscape is partly to learn how to read those living instruments without disturbing the music they are already making. Tonight, you do not need to read them closely, yet the knowledge can rest in the background, like a gentle explanation breathing beneath the sensory world. The rushes stand a little taller than the surrounding grass, their shapes dark and fine against the low mist, and drops gather along them in faint beads. A moth passes near one stem and vanishes, not into nothing, but into the dense small world that continues beyond the reach of your sight. The hiddenness of it is peaceful, because the Machair does not offer itself all at once, and no single walk day or season could ever contain the whole of it. There is always more waiting quietly, which means there is no need to hurry. The rain has stopped entirely now, and the clouds are moving eastward in a slow procession, their lower edges smudged with grey where they pass over the moor. Behind them, the western sky opens into deeper blue-black, and a cool clarity spreads over the dunes, making their outlines softer and more definite at the same time. You can sense the ocean under that sky, immense and unseen, the source of so much weather, sand, and sound. Yet tonight it remains gentle behind the dune ridge. The Machair listens to it as it has listened for centuries, receiving its salt breath, its shell dust, its storms and calms, and making from them a low, flowered peace. This peace is not the absence of change, because the coast is always changing, and the meadow is always responding to pressures both visible and hidden. It is instead the peace of continuity, the feeling that change itself can become rhythmic when it belongs to a long enough pattern and a well-practiced place. The dunes shift, the flowers return, the birds nest, the sand moves, the rain falls, and the shore keeps speaking in its rounded voice. Nothing stays exactly the same, yet the Machair remains recognizably itself, held together by process rather than by stillness. You can let that be a comfort. That identity may live in rhythm as much as in form, in returning movements as much as fixed shape. The path brings you near a patch where thyme grows low among the grass, and although the darkness hides its tiny leaves, your step releases a faint warm scent. It rises briefly into the cool night, aromatic and small, then disperses into salt and dampness, leaving only the memory of summer sun held in a plant close to the ground. Such scents are part of the Machair's intimacy because they require closeness, slowness, and the accidental touch of foot or hand to be noticed at all. The landscape does not announce them from afar, but gives them quietly when you are already within it, already moving at the proper pace. And this proper pace is slow enough for sleep, slow enough for noticing, slow enough for the world to become near without becoming loud. You may think of the flower heads in daylight, how they would attract bees and hoverflies, how the small tongues and feet of insects would move through them with practiced delicacy. Pollination here is not a grand spectacle, yet it is one of the meadow's central exchanges, linking plant bodies to insect bodies and turning color, scent, and nectar into seed. A bee that visits clover carries more than pollen because it carries the future shape of the meadow in a fine dust caught on hair and leg. When many such visits happen across a season, the Machair's next year is partly prepared, quietly, repeatedly, blossom by blossom. At night, those daytime movements are only remembered, but the memory adds warmth to the dark, like knowing a room has been sunlit even after evening has cooled it. The grass underfoot gleams faintly where drops remain, and when you pass, the stems lean away and then lift again, erasing most of your movement behind you. This soft erasure is another kindness of the place, because it does not hold every mark too sharply, allowing wind, growth, and weather to smooth the surface over time. The land remembers in deeper ways than footprints, through soil, seed bank, dune form, and the continuing relationship between beach and field. What needs to remain is held, and what can pass is allowed to pass. The Machair is full of this gentle discernment. A colder thread of air descends from the moor, meeting the salt air from the shore, and for a moment you can feel two parts of the island touching around you. The mingling is subtle, not a clash but a blending, like darker peat water entering a pale sandy pool and changing it by degrees. Many landscapes are made in such meetings, and the Machair is one of the tenderest examples, where sea-borne minerals and land-borne organic matter create a ground neither could make alone. Its ecology depends on contact, and its beauty depends on balance, which is why it feels so much like a held breath between larger worlds. You stand within that held breath, and the night seems to widen softly around the island. The stars above are now reflected in a few small puddles along the path, not clearly, but as trembling points that break whenever a breeze wrinkles the water. Those puddles may be gone tomorrow if the wind dries the ground, or they may remain through another day of cloud, feeding damp-loving plants and offering small drinking places to birds. Temporary water is still real water, just as brief flowers are still real flowers, and the Machair understands the importance of things that appear for a while and then withdraw. The briefness does not make them less part of the place. It makes them part of the rhythm by which the place becomes itself. You can feel how this thought lowers the mind toward rest, because not everything needs to last unchanged in order to belong. The ocean's voice grows softer again, and perhaps the wind has shifted, carrying the sound more along the shore than over the dunes. Now the nearest sound is the faint tapping of droplets falling from higher stems to lower leaves, a small after rain that continues long after the sky itself has cleared. This delayed rain belongs to the vegetation, held and released by leaf shape, surface tension, gravity, and the tiny movements of air through the grass. Even after weather passes, the landscape continues weathering itself, finishing the event in small private gestures close to the ground. So the night becomes filled with endings that are not abrupt, endings that trail gently into other beginnings, like thoughts fading into dreams. You follow the path until it nearly disappears in a wider patch of low grass, and then you slow, letting your feet choose the softest way. The Machair does not require a destination tonight, and the absence of one feels like part of its invitation, because wandering here is less about arrival than attunement. To be attuned is simply to let the place set the scale, and this place sets it low, wide, detailed, and patient. It asks you to notice how a shell becomes sand, how sand becomes soil, how soil becomes flower, and how flower becomes seed beneath a rain-dark sky. It asks this without words, and because there are no words, the asking is very gentle. The damp air cools your skin, but not sharply, and the ground remains soft enough that each step feels placed rather than taken. Above the dunes, a wider break in the cloud reveals more stars, and the open sky seems to rest directly on the grass, with very little distance between them. In such a low landscape, the sky becomes part of the ground's experience, because there are few vertical forms to interrupt the exchange of light, weather, and attention. The Machair lies under that sky like a listening surface, receiving day, night, rain, salt, bird shadow, and starlight with the same quiet patience. And you, standing within it, may begin to feel that receiving is also a kind of peace. There is nothing to solve here, nothing to overcome, nothing to chase across the horizon, only the old coastal meadow and its layered calm. The flowers will not open faster because they are watched. The tide will not turn sooner because it is expected, and the dunes will not hold more firmly because they are named. Everything is happening at its own proper speed, and that speed is slow enough to hold sleep, slow enough to carry the body away from the bright edges of waking thought. You can let your shoulders lower, let your jaw unclench, let the breath come and go as quietly as wind through the grass. The Machair continues around you, low, pale, damp, and breathing. Perhaps, somewhere out of sight, a corncrake moves through the cover, hidden among the stems in the way its kind has long preferred, more often heard than seen. Its summer call, when it comes, can seem plain and repetitive, yet within the ecology of the macaire, it belongs like a stitch in a woven cloth. Ground nesting birds depend on the structure of the grass, the timing of growth, the shelter of stems, and the availability of insects, all of which tie their lives to the meadow's seasonal rhythms. Even when no call is heard, the possibility of such hidden life gives the night a quiet depth, like a room where someone is sleeping peacefully behind a closed door. You do not need to enter that room to feel its presence. The path turns slightly toward the inland edge, where the Machair begins again to mingle with darker ground, and the scent of peat becomes faintly stronger. This is where the shell sand's influence thins, and the island's older wetness begins to speak more clearly through heather, moss, and the darker breath of moorland soil. The transition is soft beneath the night, but the plants would tell it plainly in daylight, changing in community as chemistry and moisture shift under the roots. Such changes remind you that landscapes are not only seen from above, as maps and outlines, but from below, as conditions felt by roots in the dark. The roots world is one of gradients, not borders, and perhaps the mind can learn from that softness. You remain on the mature side of the transition, where the ground is still pale beneath the living cover, still touched by shell and shore. Looking back toward the dunes, you can sense the entire width of the meadow now, not broad in the way of plains on continents, but broad enough for the island, broad enough for wind and birds. Its scale is human and more than human at once, wide enough to wander, small enough to know through repeated walking, and complex enough never to be fully known. That combination gives it a rare tenderness, because it feels both intimate and ancient, both fragile and enduring, both ordinary and quietly marvelous. A soft exhale of wind crosses from the sea and runs low over the grass, and the meadow bends in a single slow gesture before lifting again. For a moment, the movement makes the land look fluid, as though the Machair were not fixed ground, but a green tide lying just behind the dunes. This resemblance is fitting, because the meadow owes so much to water, even here where your feet stand on land and flowers grow from soil. The sea has not ended at the beach. It has continued inward as mineral, wind, moisture, and sound, becoming part of a landscape that appears terrestrial but remembers the ocean. You can rest in that memory, letting it carry you the way a gentle current might carry something small and unresisting through shallow water. The darkness thickens at the bases of the dunes, while their upper edges remain lightly outlined against the sky, and the beach beyond becomes more imagined than seen. In imagination, the shells are turning there, white and brown and pinkish in the wash, each one softened by contact with others, by sand, by tide, and by time. There is no haste in their breaking down, and no waste in their disappearance, because the broken form becomes available to new processes, new habitats, new life. The Machair is the flowering of those disappearances, the meadow form of countless shells whose individual shapes have been given back to the whole. That is a peaceful thing to consider, not loss as vanishing, but loss as joining. Your feet find a dry, tufted place near the path, and you pause there, while the wind passes again, carrying the distant salt scent more strongly for a few breaths. The grass is almost black now, but where it parts, the sand below is a muted grey, and that grey is enough to remind you of the pale world hidden under night. Morning will return colour to it, but the colour is not gone. It is only resting beyond your eyes, held in pebbles and leaves, until light can touch them again. In the same way, the day's sounds are resting, the bees, the larks, the insects in sunlight, all quiet now but not erased. The meadow is in its night form, and its night form is complete. A long cloud moves away from the moon, if the moon is there, and a mild silverness spreads across the open ground without becoming bright. The effect is subtle, more a change in texture than illumination, and the wet grass takes it in small strokes along the tips of leaves. The dunes appear paler, the hollows darker, and the whole Machair becomes a low relief of gentle rises and softened depressions, like a map made for dreaming hands. Moonlight, Shell, sand, and damp grass belong together easily, because each softens the others, and none of them asks to dominate the night. The world is visible just enough, and hidden just enough, for sleep. You may feel the tiredness now as a pleasant weight, not heavy in a troubling way, but like a warm blanket laid over the mind after a long day of looking. The Machair seems to encourage that weight, because everything around you has lowered itself toward rest, and even the moving sea sounds drowsy beyond the dunes. There is a deep kindness in landscapes that do not demand excitement, and the Hebridean Machair is one of those places, offering its wonder in low tones and slow revelations. It does not need height to be vast, or darkness to be mysterious, or rarity to be precious, though it has all the quiet rarity of a habitat made from exact conditions. It is enough that it lies here, flowered in summer, wind-brushed in winter, shell-rich, bird-haunted, and patient under the Atlantic sky. The moon slips behind thin cloud again, and the silverness dims, leaving the meadow in a more even dark that feels soft after the brief increase of light. Your hearing widens once more, taking in the shore, the grass, the faintest movements nearby, and the open silence that surrounds the island beyond all smaller sounds. Silence here is not a blank space, but a wide container holding each sound gently and allowing it to fade without being replaced too quickly. This is why the Machair feels so suited to rest, because nothing crowds the senses, and even complexity arrives in a softened form. The mind can wander among details without being caught, then return to the sea's breathing whenever it needs a simpler rhythm. You begin to move back along the path, not retracing in any urgent way, but allowing your steps to follow the low thread through the grass. The same places feel different now after darkness, rain, mist, and moonlight, though the changes are quiet, and the land remains itself beneath them all. A hollow that earlier seemed merely damp now feels like a small basin of night, a dune slope like a sleeping shoulder, a flower patch like a memory folded into the ground. The Machair gives these impressions freely, and you receive them without needing to keep them, letting each one pass through and settle somewhere below thought. Walking becomes a way of being carried by the land. The shell sand under the turf has held the day's warmth poorly, because sand cools readily beneath open sky, and now the ground gives back a clear coolness through the soles of your feet. That coolness is clean and steady, matched by the air and the wet stems, and it makes the whole surface of the meadow feel freshly made. Of course it is not newly made, but in the night after rain, old places can feel renewed, as if every grain and leaf has been quietly rinsed into presence. The scent of the thyme is gone now, replaced by damp grass, salt, and the faint peat dark air drifting from inland. Each breath gathers the coast into the body and releases it again. The exchange feels simple. A few more steps bring you near the earlier patch of low white flowers, and though their petals are closed or dimmed, they are still faintly visible as small pale marks. You remember their daytime openness, how they would have faced the light, and that memory gives them a second bloom in the mind, softer than the first. Many things in the Machair have this double life, one in the open brightness of summer days, and another in memory shadow, seed, and root. The second life may be quieter, but it is no less real, and it is the one the night reveals most gently. It is the life of waiting, resting, storing, and returning. The sea wind crosses the dunes again, and this time it carries a slightly stronger scent of kelp, a dark marine sweetness that rises and fades within a few breaths. That scent reminds you that beyond the visible meadow, the shore is lined with seaweed, pools, stones, and shell fragments, all part of the wider coastal system that feeds the Machair indirectly. Nothing stops at the dune line, though the landform suggests a boundary. Matter moves, animals move, air moves, and the memory of the ocean moves through every part of this place. To understand the Machair is to understand permeability, the way a landscape can be open to influence while still remaining itself. This openness is not weakness, but the source of its unusual grace. You can feel the same principle in the quiet of the body, as the night enters through skin and breath, and the earlier concerns of the day begin to loosen their outlines. Thoughts do not have to be pushed away. They can be allowed to move through like wind through grass, bending the mind briefly and then passing on. The Machair offers no argument, only example. And its example is a long history of receiving what comes, holding what can be held, and letting the rest move onward. The sea does this, the dunes do this, the flowers do this, and the soil does this in its own dark and patient way. You can do this too, softly, without effort, within the island's breathing. The path nears the place where you first entered the open meadow, though in darkness it feels less like an entrance and more like another fold in the same continuous land. There is no clear beginning now and no clear end. Only the low grassland spreading behind the dunes and the moor lying quiet beyond it. This absence of sharpness is soothing because sleep also comes without a single boundary most nights, arriving instead as a gradual softening of thought, sensation, and time. One moment you are walking in the Machair, and another moment you are almost dreaming it, and between the two there is only a gentle blur. The meadow understands the blur. It lives between sea and land, between sand and soil, between wild process and human-tended openness, between the brightness of flowers and the deep mineral memory beneath them. It is not less real for being in between. It is more itself there, more finely tuned, more able to hold the many small lives that depend on its transitions. In-between places can be restful because they do not force a choice. And here, at the Atlantic edge, the Machair lets you belong to weather ground, water, and sky all at once. The night gathers those elements into one low hush, and you can feel yourself gathered with them, less separate, less hurried, more willing to be still. A final bird call threads across the meadow, very faint now, and it vanishes before you can identify it, leaving only a widening silence behind. You do not need the name of the bird, because the sound has already done its work, touching the air, marking the dusk, and returning to quiet. Names are useful, but they are not the whole of knowing. Sometimes knowing is only hearing a call fade over wet grass and feeling the place receive it. The Machair can be studied by botany, geology, hydrology, ornithology, and soil science, yet it can also be known by walking slowly through evening rain. Both forms of knowing are welcome here, and neither has to disturb the peace. The dunes are close again, and their slopes rise gently beside you, dark at the base, paler above, with maram leaves moving in small, dry whispers. At the foot of the dune, shell sand has drifted over the edge of the grass, making a pale fan where the path widens and the vegetation thins. You can see how easily the system shifts, with sand covering plants in one place and plants trapping sand in another, each process answering the other in small adjustments. This living negotiation keeps the dune and meadow connected, not as fixed forms, but as parts of a single moving coast. The movement is slow tonight, nearly imperceptible, and that slowness feels like mercy. You stand at the edge of the dune shadow, listening to the Atlantic beyond, and the sound is fuller again, perhaps because the path has brought you nearer the shore. The waves are not seen, but each one seems to arrive through the sand, through the dune roots, through the grass, and finally through the quiet spaces in your chest. There is no need to count them, because their repetition is beyond counting, and to count would be to make edges where the night has made flow. Better to let them continue, wave after wave, breath after breath, until the distinction between listening and resting becomes very slight. The Machair holds you at that slight distinction, in a soft place just before sleep. Behind you, the meadow lies damp and low, with its closed flowers, hidden insects, waiting seeds, and roots woven through soil made partly from sea. Before you, the dunes rise and fall in darkness, sheltering the beach where shells continue their long unmaking under the tide. Above you, the stars appear and fade behind moving cloud, while the island rests beneath them with its moor, its crofts, its locks, its beaches, and its rare pale grassland facing west. All of it feels very quiet now, not because life has gone away, but because life has lowered its voice to match the hour. And in that lowered voice, the Hebridean Machair continues, breathing softly between ocean and earth, while the night settles over every flower, every grain, every root. Every root remains hidden, and yet the hiddenness feels like part of the comfort, because the Machair is a place where the most important structures do not need to rise above the ground. The low flowers, the close grass, the pale sand, and the old shell fragments all belong to a world that keeps its strength near the surface, where wind can pass over it without finding much to break. You can feel that low strength as you stand in the dark, not as force, but as steadiness. The kind of steadiness that comes from yielding often and returning slowly. The whole meadow seems to know how to bend, and in that knowledge there is a kind of wisdom. The Atlantic continues beyond the dunes, and though the waves are hidden, the sound carries the shape of them inland, broadening and thinning as it passes through grass and sand. Each wave arrives already softened by distance, so what reaches you is not a crash, but a long folded murmur, like breath drawn through the edge of a shell. That sound has been arriving here for longer than any path, longer than any fence, longer than any summer flowering you can imagine, and still it enters the night gently. It moves through the Machair as an old companion moves through a familiar room without asking to be noticed, yet changing the feeling of everything by being there. You begin to follow the dune line slowly, letting the meadow remain to one side and the hidden beach to the other, though the boundary between them is mostly felt rather than seen. The sand underfoot grows a little looser near the base of the slope, and your steps become softer, pressing into the pale grains beneath the sparse grass. Here the vegetation is more open, because wind, salt, and shifting sand create a harder place for roots, but even here, small plants find sheltered corners and hold on. A tiny rosette of leaves, almost invisible in the dimness, may be waiting between two stems of marram, gathering moisture drop by drop and light day by day. Such small persistence suits the Machair, where life often works close to the ground and takes its time with appearing. The dune itself seems larger from below, though it is still a gentle form, its slope lifting toward a crest that the wind has rounded again and again. In daylight, grains of sand would show in every exposed patch, each one pale because it carries the remains of shell and coral-like algae from the nearby sea. These carbonate sands are part of what makes the Machair unusual, because they give the soil a lime-rich character that differs strongly from the older acidic ground behind it. The meadow is therefore not merely a place behind dunes, but the flowering expression of a geological meeting between marine remains and island weather. Rain has fallen here through many seasons, and every shower has done a small piece of the work, washing salt from leaves, moving dissolved minerals, and feeding the roots below. Wind has done another part, carrying sand inland, shaping dunes, drying exposed ridges, and pressing plants into low habits that suit the openness of the coast. The sea has done another part, making and delivering shell fragments, smoothing them, breaking them, and offering them to the shore with each returning tide. No single force owns the Machair, and its calm comes partly from this shared making, this slow cooperation among water, air, mineral, plant, and time. You can rest your attention on the idea of shared making, because it removes the need for one grand cause and replaces it with many small causes moving together. A landscape does not need to be dramatic to be profound, and the Machair shows this by spreading its depth across low ground, where the most remarkable changes are often felt as texture. The springiness beneath your feet, the brightness of soil at dusk, the abundance of flowers in summer, and the hidden nests of birds all arise from relationships too quiet to announce themselves. They are quiet, but they are complete, and completeness here feels soft enough to sleep inside. The night deepens around that softness. A faint gleam appears where the path curves through damp grass, and it may be water held in a shallow hoofprint, reflecting a small broken piece of the sky. Around that tiny pool, stems lean inward from the edge, and beads of rain cling to them like small, clear seeds, waiting for wind or gravity to return them to the ground. In the morning, a bird may drink there, an insect may cross its surface, or sunlight may draw it back into air before it ever reaches a root. For now, it simply rests, a small mirror in the Machair, holding darkness, starlight, and the memory of rain. You pass it without disturbing it, and the grass closes behind you with a sound so slight that it almost belongs more to feeling than hearing. The path narrows again, threading between hummocks where sand has gathered around clumps of vegetation, and the ground rises and falls in miniature dunes beneath the turf. These low undulations are easy to miss, but they are part of the Machair's living shape because wind does not lay sand evenly and plants do not catch it evenly. Over time, the surface becomes patterned by these subtle catches and releases, small waves of land echoing the larger waves just beyond the shore. The meadow is full of echoes like this, and each one makes the place feel quietly connected. The waveforms in the grass answer the sea, the pale sand answers the shells, the bird calls answer the open sky, and the flowers answer the lime-rich ground beneath them. Even your own slow movement begins to answer the landscape, because the more gently you walk, the more the Machair seems to reveal without needing to speak. You are not exploring in the hurried sense. You are allowing the place to unfold at the speed of noticing, which is slower and more restful than discovery. The night makes that pace easier, because it removes the bright edges from things and leaves you with presence, rhythm, and breath. The scent of damp marram becomes stronger as you near a thicker stand, its leaves narrow and tough, rolled slightly to reduce the loss of water in salt wind. This small adaptation, almost invisible unless you look closely, allows the plant to live where the air can be drying even when the climate is wet. Its roots and underground stems reach through the sand in a living lattice, and that lattice helps catch the dune in place, though the dune itself never becomes perfectly still. The plant and the sand are in conversation, one growing as the other gathers, one binding as the other shifts, and the entire slope rises through that patient exchange. You can imagine a winter storm crossing the Atlantic, bringing stronger winds and higher waves, moving sand in ways that would seem dramatic if watched closely. Yet even then, the Machair's story is not one of threat, but of renewal, because disturbance can open bare patches where certain plants germinate, and new sand can refresh the lime-rich surface. The system depends on motion held within limits, enough movement to keep the grassland open, enough stability for roots and nests and flowering seasons to continue. It is a balance written not in stillness, but in repeated recovery, and that thought carries a quiet reassurance into the dark. The wind brushes across the dune crest, and you hear the dry marram whisper above the lower, wetter sound of the meadow grass. Two kinds of grass, two textures of air, two parts of the same coast, and between them, your footsteps move slowly through the narrow place where dune becomes field. The sky above remains clouded in some places and open in others, so the light on the land subtly changes without ever fully brightening. A star appears, disappears, and appears again, while the Machair beneath it continues to hold its low shape, patient with every passing veil. Clouds move, but the ground receives their shadow without concern, and the night remains gentle. There is something deeply calming about a landscape that does not require clear weather to be beautiful, because its beauty is not dependent on brightness alone. Mist, rain, dimness, and wind all belong here, and each one reveals a different quality of the Machair's softness, resilience, and open form. Under sun, it may seem full of color and insect movement, but under cloud it becomes tonal, textured, and inward, more about scent and sound than sight. Tonight, it is the inward version of the meadow that holds you, the version made of softened edges and listening. A low hollow opens near the path, broader than the others, and in the darkness it looks like a slightly deeper shade laid into the grass. During wetter months, such hollows may hold standing water or saturated soils, creating small seasonal wetlands within the Machair and adding another layer to its ecological richness. The plants there are different because their roots meet water more often, and the insects are different because dampness changes shelter, food, and timing. A bird moving through the meadow may know these differences by habit, without map or name, reading the ground through memory, scent, sight, and need. You can imagine the same hollow in morning, perhaps with mist lifting from it and droplets shining on rushes, while a skylark rises from the nearby grass into the pale air. The song would climb higher and higher until the bird became almost invisible, yet the sound would remain, pouring down over the open land like a fine stream of light. But that is morning's world, and tonight the hollow is quiet, holding only moisture, darkness, and the low expectancy of forms waiting for daylight. The imagination can visit morning without leaving night, and then it can return, as softly as a tide returning to the shore. The path carries you farther along the dune foot, and you notice that your thoughts now move with fewer sharp turns, as though the land has rubbed their edges smooth. This is partly the rhythm of walking, partly the sound of the sea, and partly the steady recurrence of grass, sand, wind, and cloud across the senses. Sleep often begins this way, not by stopping the mind all at once, but by giving it a pattern gentle enough to follow until following becomes drifting. The Machair offers such a pattern naturally, and every detail seems placed to continue it. Not too bright, not too dense, not too empty. It is a landscape of moderation, and moderation can be deeply soothing. The shell sand under the grass glows faintly when the cloud thins, and you can see pale seams where the turf opens along the path. Those seams reveal the ground's marine origin more clearly than any explanation could, because the sand itself has the color of broken shell, weathered bone, and moonlit shore. It is strange and peaceful to think that the meadow is built from the remains of creatures that formed hard parts in the sea, then gave those forms back to the coast after death. Their fragments now support flowers, insects, grazing animals, and birds, not by intention but by becoming available to the slow creativity of natural process. This availability is one of nature's quiet miracles, the way forms dissolve into materials and materials become conditions for other lives. A shell becomes sand, sand becomes soil, soil becomes clover, clover feeds a bee, and the bee helps the meadow continue into another season of bloom. Nothing in that chain needs to be hurried, and perhaps its peacefulness comes from the fact that each stage is allowed to be itself before becoming something else. The Machair is not a monument to permanence, but to gentle transformation, and that makes it especially suited to the edge of sleep. You breathe slowly, and the damp air seems to enter with the taste of salt and grass, then leave with some small part of the day's remaining tension. The sea breathes too, though not like a body, and the dunes breathe in their way as wind moves over them and through the maram stems. The meadow breathes through countless leaves, exchanging with the night air in quiet microscopic gestures, each opening and closing far too small to be seen. All these breathings overlap, and standing here among them, you can feel how rest may come from joining a rhythm larger than your own. The Machair becomes a wide, low lung of land. There is still a little rain held in the air, not falling now, but suspended as dampness that softens every surface and rounds every scent. The stones, if there are small stones along the path, are darkened by it, and the sand is cool under its influence, while the grass remains lightly beaded. The island climate is written in this dampness, in the way the air seldom feels entirely separate from sea, cloud, soil, or skin. Here, weather is not scenery placed above the land. It is an active part of the land's body, entering roots, shaping growth, moving sand, and guiding season. You can sense why the Machair belongs particularly to these Atlantic-facing edges, where the right sand, wind, rain exposure, and traditional openness come together. Elsewhere, any one condition might be missing, and the landscape would become something else, perhaps dune without meadow, pasture without shell sand, or moor without the bright, low flowers. But here, the conditions have met in a rare and delicate arrangement, giving the Hebrides one of their most quietly distinctive landscapes. The rarity is not loud, because nothing in the Machair is loud, yet it deepens the feeling of being with something precious. A faint line of foam may be forming beyond the dunes with each incoming wave, though from here it is only imagined through sound. Foam is another brief form, made by water, air, and dissolved organic matter, appearing white for a moment before collapsing back into the sea. The Machair has many brief forms too: dewdrops, petals, bird tracks, seed heads, thin mist, and the quick glimmer of insects turning in sunlight. Together these briefnesses create continuity, because the place persists by allowing countless temporary things to rise and fade within it. There is peace in a world that can be constant, without requiring anything within it to remain unchanged. Your steps slow even more, and now you are almost standing between each movement, letting the night place itself fully around you before your foot finds the next soft patch. The path is not demanding, and neither is the view, so the whole act of walking becomes spacious, with more attention in the pauses than in the progress. A breeze moves against your face and then away, and you can follow its path across the grass by sound, as if the darkness were showing motion through touch rather than light. The Machair is teaching the senses to lean on one another, sight yielding to hearing, hearing to smell, smell to the quiet pressure of ground underfoot. Everything becomes less separate and more woven. At the inland edge, the dark moor gathers moisture in its peat, holding water like a memory, while the Machair near the coast drains and reflects differently through sand and shell. The contrast between them is subtle tonight, but it is one of the great quiet contrasts of the Hebridean landscape. Dark acid ground beside pale alkaline grassland. Where one supports heather, bog cotton, sphagnum and wet hollows, the other supports clover, orchids, fine grasses, and summer bright flower communities shaped by lime and exposure. The island holds both, side by side, and their nearness makes each more vivid in the mind, even under the low darkness. You do not have to choose between them. No, tonight you remain with the Machair, because its pale softness is the path of this slow wandering. The moor waits beyond, ancient and deep in its own way, and perhaps its darker presence helps the flowered coastal plain feel more tender. Every landscape is partly defined by what it touches, and the Machair touches sea, dune, moor, sky, and weather with extraordinary delicacy. It is a meeting place, and meeting places often carry a feeling of quiet threshold. The word threshold fits the ground under your feet, because the Machair belongs to crossings, from ocean to land, from mineral to living tissue, from open shore to sheltered grass. Even the evening itself is a threshold, neither day nor full night, and your own drowsiness is another, a soft passage from clear thought toward dream. These thresholds align around you without any need for ceremony, and the place becomes restful because everything is already in the act of becoming gently less distinct. The edges soften, the senses soften, the path softens, and the mind begins to follow. It is a very natural descent, not a descent into depth as in the ocean, but a descent into lowland quiet, into grass height, root depth, sand layer, and the older hush beneath the island. The Machair invites you downward by lowering the scale of wonder until you are no longer looking for horizons, but for the small shine of water on a leaf. Then it lowers you further, into the thought of that leaf's root, and further still, into the shell sand that the root touches in darkness. At last, the mind rests not above the landscape, observing it, but within its soft arrangement of relationships. That is where the sleepiness gathers. The tide sounds a little fuller again, and the surf seems to spread wider along the shore, perhaps because the wind has opened a clearer passage through the dunes. You can almost feel the beach breathing flat and pale under the unseen sky, with every wave laying a cool sheet across it and then drawing away. When the water leaves, it may carry some grains seaward and leave others behind, and over long time those small decisions of motion help shape the shore's supply of sand. The Machair begins far out in such decisions, in the breaking of shell, the moving of sediment, the sorting of grains by wave and wind. It begins before the meadow looks like a meadow, in the patience of the coast. This thought widens the darkness, making the hidden beach feel connected to the ground at your feet, as though the whole system were one slow breath from sea floor to flower. The shells in shallow water, the strand line on the beach, the dunes with marram, the grassland with clover, and the moor beyond all belong to the same westward-facing world. Seen from above, it might be a series of bands along the island, but from within it feels more like a gradual mingling of textures, scents, and sounds. You stand in one band, yet the others are present through influence, and the night holds them together in silence. A small animal moves somewhere in the grass too quietly to identify, and the sound lasts only a moment before returning to the general hush. The meadow accepts that movement the way it accepts wind, rain, and seed fall, adding it to the brief activity of night without disturbance. Many lives here are small enough to remain unnamed in ordinary attention, but their accumulated presence gives the ecosystem its subtle fullness. Without them, the flowers would have fewer visitors, the soil fewer makers of passage, the birds fewer meals, and the grassland less of its hidden motion. You can feel grateful for what you cannot see, not in a formal way, but as a relaxed awareness that the world is alive beyond the limits of notice. This awareness does not sharpen you, it softens you, because it removes the need to hold everything in the mind at once. The Machair continues whether you name every plant or none of them, whether you trace every process or simply listen to the waves. There is freedom in that, and the freedom is drowsy, spacious, and kind. The dune line begins to dip, and through a lower place you sense more openness ahead, perhaps a gap where wind has carried sand inland during stronger weather. Such gaps are part of dune life, because dunes are not fortifications but moving forms, and their openings can feed the Machair with fresh sand when conditions allow. Fresh shell sand can brighten the soil again, adding lime and texture, while also disturbing the vegetation enough to create new opportunities for small plants. Disturbance here is not only loss, it can be renewal when it arrives within the long rhythm the ecosystem has adapted to receive. The land is not fragile because it changes, but fragile when its old rhythms are broken too sharply or too completely. Tonight, though, the gap is only a softer place in the dune shadow, and the wind through it carries a clearer breath of the sea. You pause there, letting the cooler air move around you, and for a moment the beach feels very near, as if the hidden shore has leaned inward. The scent is saltier, with a trace of kelp and wet sand, and beneath it remains the green damp scent of the Machair, rising from the grass after rain. Two breaths of the landscape meet in the same air, and you breathe them together without separating them. The blending feels whole. The clouds part a little more, and the pale sand in the dune gap becomes visible, curving downward toward the unseen beach like a quiet path. You do not need to follow it, because the Machair itself is enough, and because staying at the edge allows both shore and meadow to remain present. Sometimes the most restful place is not at the center of anything, but between two presences, where attention can move gently back and forth without arriving. Here, sea and grass, dune and field, darkness and memory all take turns holding you, and none of them asks for more than a soft return of awareness. The night is wide, but the moment is small. In the grass beside the gap, some flowers are more exposed to salt spray, and their leaves may be thicker, lower, or arranged to reduce the drying effects of wind. Plants along coasts often carry such subtle adaptations, not as dramatic signs, but as quiet bodily knowledge shaped over generations by weather and place. The Machair's plant communities are full of these small negotiations between growth and exposure, flowering and grazing, seed-making and disturbance, openness and shelter. Each plant is a response to conditions, and each response becomes part of the conditions for other lives, until the whole meadow is a web of mutual adjustment. This web has no single visible thread that explains everything, but you can sense its presence in the way the landscape feels both delicate and coherent. If the grass grows too rank, some flowers lose space. If grazing becomes too heavy, others struggle. If sand stops moving, the soil changes. If too much sand arrives, roots may be buried. Balance is not a fixed point here, but a slow conversation among pressures, and the Machair's beauty is the visible trace of that conversation. Continuing, you listen, and the conversation is quiet enough to become a lullaby. It is a slow language. The tide folds again beyond the dunes, and the sound travels through the gap with a deeper tone, then softens as the wind shifts. You begin to move away from the gap, back into the low meadow where the grass is thicker and the path becomes more cushioned. The wet stems brush lightly against your ankles, and each touch is cool, brief, and almost identical to the last, creating a repetition that draws attention downward. Your body understands repetition before thought does, and the steady sameness of footstep, breath, surf, and grass begins to feel like being rocked. The Machair rocks without moving, through rhythm, texture, and sound. A low bank of cloud covers the stars again, and the land loses the faint silver it had gathered, returning to a more even and intimate darkness. In this darkness, the flowers are no longer separate points, but the memory of them remains spread through the field, like a scent that no longer needs a source. You remember yellow, white, purple, pink, and soft green, all lying now beneath the same dark cover, and the remembering becomes another form of seeing. The night asks you to trust that color can rest unseen, just as seeds rest unseen, just as roots work unseen. and just as sleep gathers before it is felt. You can trust the unseen here because the visible world has already shown its gentleness, and because the sounds that remain are steady. Nothing rises suddenly, nothing sharpens, nothing demands a quicker pulse, and even the wind moves as though mindful of the hour. The Machair continues low and calm, its rare abundance folded into darkness, its geology hidden beneath living turf, its shore breathing nearby. You are simply walking with it, or perhaps by now you are almost being walked by it, carried along its faint path through the night. A slight rise in the ground gives you one more view across the meadow, and the whole Machair appears as a dark, open sweep held between dune and moor. You cannot see its flowers now, yet you know they are there, closed and damp, with pollen dust tucked in their small structures and seeds forming where flowers have already passed. You cannot see the shell fragments below, yet you know they are there too, pale and countless, making a different chemistry from the peat dark inland soil. The visible and invisible sit together, and the place becomes more restful because the mind is no longer trying to separate them. It is enough to feel the presence of both. The sea has been speaking all along, and now its voice seems to merge with the silence instead of standing apart from it. This happens sometimes with steady sounds, when repetition becomes so familiar that it no longer feels like an object of hearing, but like the room in which hearing takes place. The surf becomes the room of the Machair, and within that room the grasses move, the drops fall, the insects pass, and your breathing grows slower. You do not need to follow each sound separately anymore, because the whole soundscape has become one soft surrounding field. It holds you without weight. The path bends inland for a while, away from the strongest salt air, and the scent of wet vegetation becomes fuller. Here, the grass may grow slightly taller where shelter is greater, and the dampness persists in small hollows that gather rain from the surrounding ridges. The open structure remains, but it becomes more lush in the darkness, more enfolding, and your steps are quieter because the plants close around the path. Still, the Machair does not become enclosed, because above it the sky remains wide, and beyond it the sea continues to remind the land of space. A single late call comes from somewhere near the moor edge, thin and distant, then fades into the wet air before it can become a pattern. The quiet after it feels deeper, not empty, but deepened by the sound's departure, the way a ripple makes still water more noticeable after it smooths away. This is how the Machair holds sound, allowing each small note to appear, move outward, and return to the larger softness of the coast. Your own thoughts can do the same, appearing briefly, moving outward, and then settling without needing an answer. The land makes room for letting go. The soil beneath the grass is cooling further now, and the dampness in the air has become part of the skin, the breath, the fabric of the night. Somewhere below your steps, calcium from old shells rests beside decayed stems, forming a mixture of marine and terrestrial matter that makes this ground unlike the inland moor. This mixture is not static, because rainwater moves through it, roots enter and die back, small animals tunnel, and new sand may arrive after strong winds. The Machair is constantly being remade at a scale too slow for ordinary attention, and yet tonight that slow remaking feels almost audible. It is audible in the surf, in the grass, in the faint settling of drops, and in the quiet spaces where imagination supplies what the senses cannot reach. You imagine sand grains touching root hairs, rainwater dissolving minerals, fungi threading through the soil, and seeds resting in darkness until warmth returns. These images are not bright or sharp, but dim and soothing, like dreams of the ground itself, forming beneath the surface of waking thought. The deeper you imagine the meadow, the lower your own attention settles, until the night above and the soil below seem to meet somewhere inside the breath. The Hebrides lie around you in great quiet, island beyond island, shore beyond shore, each western edge meeting Atlantic weather in its own pattern of sand, rock, and grass. This Machair is one part of that larger coastal world, yet it feels complete here, in this particular curve of dune and meadow under the cloud-soft sky. No map is needed now, because the place has become known by nearness, by cool air, by ground texture, by the sound of waves, and by the scent of rain on grass. Geography has become sensation, and sensation has become rest. The island is near. A little farther on, the path passes through a patch where the grass has been cropped short, leaving the surface low and smooth, almost like a green shoreline held inland. Your step sounds slightly different here, lighter and closer to the sand, and the coolness rises more directly from the ground. In daylight, this place might show tiny plants that need open conditions, their leaves pressed flat, and their flowers small enough to avoid the strongest wind. At night, their individual forms are hidden, but their collective presence remains as a fine softness underfoot, a living cover no thicker than a deep breath. The smallness is the beauty. You can think of all the low-growing species adapted to this place, not as a list, but as a shared posture, a way of staying close to the earth. Close to the earth, they avoid some of the wind, reach the light in open turf, and root into mineral-rich sand that has traveled from the shore. Close to the earth, they are also close to grazing mouths, insects, soil moisture, and the hidden processes that sustain their brief flowering. The Machair's life is lived in closeness, and that closeness makes the landscape feel intimate even beneath a wide sky. The sky itself has begun to clear toward the west, and there is a dim depth above the dune line where more stars are appearing. They are not brilliant tonight because the air is still damp and some cloud remains, but they are steady enough to give the darkness a sense of height. Below them, the meadow gives the darkness a sense of breadth, and between height and breadth you stand in a quiet measure of space. It is not empty space. It is inhabited by roots, seeds, moisture, mineral, air, sound, memory, and slow change. The longer you remain, the less the Machair feels like scenery, and the more it feels like a living surface of the earth, breathing at a scale just beyond ordinary notice. This feeling does not need to be made mystical, because the science itself is tender enough, showing how life gathers where conditions allow, and how matter keeps moving through form. To understand that broken shells can become a flowered meadow is already to stand near wonder, and no sharper explanation is needed. The facts themselves are soft. If you hold them softly, they settle like sand. The path now turns gently back toward the interior of the Machair, where the dune sound is a little less direct, and the grasses seem to thicken again. The air is calmer here, and the moisture left by rain lingers on every surface, making the meadow feel freshly woven from dark green threads. You can imagine the plants drying slowly after dawn. First the upper leaves, then the lower stems, then the shaded places where drops hold on longest. By noon, if sun comes, the flowers may open again, and insects may return, and the whole field may seem transformed by light without having changed its underlying form. For now, that brightness is only a promise held in darkness. Promises in landscapes are rarely spoken, yet they are everywhere, in seed banks, swelling buds, winter roots, shifting dunes, and the first pale edge of morning below the horizon. The Machair is full of such promises, though none of them are urgent, and each one waits for the proper season, temperature, moisture, or light. This waiting is not passive in the simple sense, because waiting here is structured, prepared, and alive with readiness below the threshold of visibility. You can let yourself wait in the same way, not for anything in particular, but as a body prepared to rest when rest arrives. The night holds that readiness. A final thin wind moves over the field, and the grasses lean with it, carrying droplets from blade to blade in small touches that no eye can fully follow. The sound is so soft that it seems to happen inside the silence, not against it, and then the silence returns with the sound folded into it. This is how the Machair's night continues, through small motions that never break the calm, through living processes that never need a bright witness. You walk a few more steps and then pause, because the pause itself feels like part of the place, a low opening in time beside the breathing shore. The whole landscape is resting. The dunes rest in their long, curved forms, though grains still shift along their surfaces, and roots still hold them in darkness. The meadow rests with its flowers closed, though water still moves through soil, and the hidden creatures of the grass continue their slow night work. The moor rests beyond with its peat and heather, holding rain from older storms, while the sea rests only in the sense that its repetition is too steady to feel restless. And you rest among them, standing or drifting inward, held by the same quiet that holds shell, seed, root, and wave. The holding is gentle. The darkness gathers more fully now, smoothing the last differences between path and field, between hollow and ridge, between the near grass and the farther dunes. Yet the distinctions remain beneath the smoothing, just as thoughts remain beneath sleep, loosened and dimmed but not forced away. The Machair knows how to keep form inside softness, how to remain itself while letting night cover its details. And this knowledge seems to pass quietly into you. You do not need to see clearly to be held clearly. You do not need to know every detail to belong to the moment. The sea speaks once more through the dune gap, low and rounded, and the sound comes to you almost like a final reassurance from the hidden shore. It says nothing in words, yet its constancy has meaning, because it has helped make this land and continues to touch it through wind, sand, salt, and weather. The meadow answers without sound, by holding the sand, feeding the flowers, sheltering the birds, and resting under the night with its roots woven into old marine fragments. Between the speaking sea and the quiet meadow, there is a deep exchange that continues beyond watching, beyond naming, beyond waking. You can let yourself become quiet enough to sense it, and as the path fades into the darker grass ahead, you remain with the Machair's low breathing, its shell-white memory beneath the soil, its closed flowers and hidden wings, its dunes shaped by wind and its shore shaped by tide, while the night moves over the Hebrides, slowly, softly, and without end.